the story of 4 businessmen.
In an era of greed.
Together, they were part of a scandal.
To find out what happens when
people start capitalizing costs,
manipulating financial statements,
and accumulating debt.
The real WorldCom, Mississippi.
My confession. Just when I thought I said all I could say, my chick on the side said she got one on the way. So my confession.
I know what I don't know. To this day, I don't know technology, I don't know finance or accounting. Dave Singleton presented me with an idea developed by Murray Waldron. Singleton has helped me finance my motel business, and he is now looking for me to finance Waldron's idea. The idea was to sell cheap, long distance to townspeople of Mississippi. The opportunity sounded so prosperous, so I funded the idea. An LDDS, long distance discount service, was established. I became the president of the company, and within a year's time, I was the CEO. Singleton and Waldron could not hack the big business world, and they removed themselves from the company when it became public. When I first became president of the company, it was $1.5 million in debt. I implemented my low-cost motel management philosophy and began to acquire other companies. The acquisition of Williams Telecommunications Group provoked me into redirecting my focus to becoming a global leader, and I changed the name to WorldCom. After the MCI acquisition, the largest in history, stock prices peaked and WorldCom was a great success. However, stock prices and revenue started to decline, and my scheme started to unravel. I knew I was in trouble when the Securities Exchange Commission began to request information regarding accounting procedures and loans to officers. However, I would continue to be positive and not downgrade my company. Even after my resignation as CEO, I continued to support WorldCom. I told everyone that it will rise again.
You wanted to see me, Evers?
We need to hit our numbers. Make it happen.
But sir.
No, make it happen.
Yes, sir. I'm guilty of conspiracy, securities fraud, and falsifying financial statements. I'm the true architect of the WorldCom fraud scheme. I rationalized my actions, however, by telling myself that I was trying to save WorldCom. Even though I kept telling Evers it wasn't right to mistake revenues, but he just looked at me and said, "We have to hit our numbers." So I adjusted the numbers to meet Wall Street's expectations. Our financials violated the revenue recognition principle because our revenues were not recognized in the periods in which they were incurred. They were pretty close, though, I thought. The revenues were distributed to periods that made our statements more appealing, which led to investors making more investment decisions about our company. Good choice. For example, the top side adjusted journal entries, or an entry that closes the gap between the actual results and the results reported to the public at the end of each quarter, were very large. Our company needed to hit revenue growth, because Evers said so, and those targets were rather difficult to reach with what we were doing. Also, we entered the world of fairy tales and made fictitious expenses entries that were not actually realized. Hey guys, I just got word from the CEO. Looks like we're having a little bit of problems with our numbers this year, but we need to make them work. We need to make them look better. So I got this idea. We're going to take some of those costs that we have, like our office supplies, expenses, and whatnot, and we're going to capitalize them over a period of time. That way our numbers will look better right now.
Isn't that illegal?
Do you value your position in this company?
I was instructed by superiors to make adjustments to company books that had no justification. No one ever brought up discrepancies during meetings or to Evers, because if we did, we were asked to leave. Evers was in control. I just did what I was told. The internal controls and overall control environment were hindered by Evers' lack of implementing high ethical standards for his employees. He didn't do it, so he didn't care if anyone else did. The lack of integrity, commitment to competence, positive management philosophy, and delegation of authority provided for the opportunity for scandal to arise. The contributions to the lack of internal controls were, well, the internal controls were not effective, therefore financial statements were not reliable and did not comply with laws and regulations. Since the audit committee was not effective in managing the internal audit department, they were unable to receive the resources needed to identify what was happening within the company. The department was understaffed, didn't have a large enough budget to complete the audit work, and the internal auditors couldn't even travel outside of Mississippi, even though the company was an international firm. They didn't have access even to our computer systems. Also, the department reported directly to Ebbers and Sullivan, and they were the ones manipulating the reports. The internal controls did not provide efficiency of operations or oversight, but the company was efficient at tricking the system and manipulating statements. Those investors, they only knew.
I knew the accounting decisions made at the company were improper, but Sullivan had me execute them anyways. I was involved with the booking of ordinary expenses as long-term capital expenditures, thus inflating reported income. My actions made at WorldCom appear profitable for at least 2 years when it was, in fact, losing money. If only I could do that in my personal life now. Anyways, I feel that investors are at fault for falling for the scheme. There were many red flags for the downfall of WorldCom. In 1999, WorldCom announced a merger with Sprint. This led to the first warning sign for our investors. WorldCom's price per earnings ratio was exceptionally high and ended up being $20 over the actual value. In 2000, the PE ratio continued to be too high and profits increased even though the stock prices decreased due to the rescinding of the decision to merge with Sprint. The last major red flag before the actual 2002 downfall of WorldCom occurred in 2001 when the stock prices halved and the PE ratio reflected a good time to buy. Also, at this time, the company took on massive amounts of debt, yet the assets were maintained. Personally, I think the shareholders were kind of dumb to do so.
Even though there were red flags for the investors, some may still be asking, why didn't the external auditors find the accounting fraud? Why did Arthur Anderson never disagree with anything that I did or anything that I put into the financial statements? The simple answer, the literal answer, is that the internal auditors did not interact with the external auditors, and therefore they did not report the internal control weakness. But the public would be a fool to believe this simple answer because the auditors had even more red flags that signified something was up. There was an extreme competition, technological change, competitive service and pricing, and tons of debt, not to mention all of the stock compensation plans that all of us are receiving. It was a bit ridiculous that we didn't get caught sooner, to be honest. WorldCom was way too big to sustain itself, and it relied on buying up smaller companies to simply survive or to offset the eventual collapse. What we could not pull off with the merger with Sprint, we really ran into some trouble. Ebbers was given a loan in order to offset some of the falling stock prices, but that loan can't solve everything forever. He would have to sell his shares without the excess debt, but it really didn't matter because the stock still plummeted under $1 in 2002.
In the end, we tried to save the company from bankruptcy by changing the severance package policies, which was extremely ethical. Instead of a lump sum paid after the employee layoffs, the severance pay would be paid out every 2 weeks. Shortly after, bankruptcy was declared, which resulted in severance pay protection. In many cases, this allowed for severance payments to be stopped. Eventually, the courts issued for an allowance for employees to collect their payments, but by that time, many employees had lost their homes. That sucks. I understand how they feel, because my pension plan was revoked after the scandal was identified. I'm sorry that about 75,000 employees were laid off and that we did not get our money. I went from rags to riches, then fell from pinstripes to prison stripes.
KPMG had the honor of looking at the mess we had created that resulted in us rocking the stripes. They found many material weaknesses, such as the need to increase the depth of financial management, implement controls for a general ledger, the need to reconcile between subsidiary and general ledgers, which is something I never heard of, and proper segregation of duties. They saw we needed policies and procedures to implement internal controls. And they said we needed analysis of non-routine transactions. I don't know what that meant. There were so many weaknesses and issues. It was almost like a blizzard had hit the company and left everything in disarray and covered it with a white sheet of lies. To respond to the epic shutdown, officers and accounting personnel were fired, like me. The accounting department was in Mississippi headquarters was shut down. A new CFO, CEO, president, and controller were appointed, and there were action plans for internal controls and ethics that were put into place. The company pretty much started from scratch, and all of our years of hard work and blood and sweat and tears and dedication to WorldCom were all screwed up, and they fixed them. Luckily, our accounting fraud scheme was so grand that we're not going to be forgotten.
Bad boys, what you gonna do? What you gonna do?
In court proceedings, Ebers was found guilty by all 9 jury members and convicted of $11 billion in accounting fraud. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison, but may be released in 23 if he displays good behavior. Today he remains locked up at the Federal Correctional Institution of Oakdale, Louisiana. Sullivan received a smaller sentence of 5 years since he pled guilty and testified against Ebers. He only served 4 out of the 5 years in a medium security federal correction facility in Georgia. He served his last year in in-home confinement. Sullivan is now living in Boca Raton.
Myers pled guilty to false filing of documents with security regulators, conspiracy to commit fraud and securities fraud, and he was sentenced to 1 year and 1 day in prison. He was spared a longer prison term because of his cooperation with the government and his early admission of responsibility and remorse.
Yates also pled guilty to false filings of documents with securities regulators, conspiracy to commit fraud, and securities fraud, and he was sentenced to 1 year and 1 day in prison. In addition, he was fined $5,000 and given 3 years probation.
Williams Telecommunications Group provoked me. Okay.
The revenues were distributed to periods that... Fight went out.
WorldCom. Shoot the... due to the rescinding... I don't know how to say that word.
Rescinding?
Rescinding.
Severance pay protection. Oh shit.
And they analyzed, that's not a word.